Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and welcome to our education webinar, Jerusalem, U.S. Policy and Its Impact. Such an honor for me to be here once again and to host this wonderful webinar with our wonderful panel. My name is Tarek Khalil, Education Coordinator for AMP, and this week marks 55 years since the start of Israel's military occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. A belligerent occupation which has been carried out in the context of and serves to entrench Israel's settler colonial project and apartheid regime, an occupation which has been condemned as illegal under international law. In Jerusalem's status under international law is actually uncontroversial. Plain and simple, it's not part of sovereign Israel. It is meant to be an international zone. And the main Israeli effort since 1967 has been to strengthen its de facto control over the whole city of Jerusalem to create, quote, urban facts, which would make any future division of the city practically impossible. The purpose of this effort is reflected in Israel's Judaization and de-Arabization policy, basically encouraging Jewish settlements and containment of Palestinian urban and demographic expansion. And we have a wonderful panel with us today to dig deeper on the question of U.S. policy regarding Jerusalem and its impact on Palestinians. I'm going to briefly introduce all three, and then we'll get straight to it. We're honored to have Lara Friedman, who is the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. With more than 25 years working in the Middle East foreign policy arena, Lara is a leading authority on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, with particular expertise on the Israeli-Arab conflict, Israeli settlements, Jerusalem, and the role of the U.S. Congress. Prior to joining FMEP, Lara was the director of Policy and Government Relations at Americans for Peace Now. And before that, she was a U.S. Foreign Service officer, serving in Jerusalem, Washington, Tunis, and Beirut. She holds a BA from the University of Arizona and a master's degree from Georgetown School of Foreign Service. We also have with us Khaled Elgindy, who is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and the author of the newly released book, Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians, From Balfour to Trump. Elgindy previously served as a fellow in the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution from 2010 through 2018. He also served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah on permanent status negotiations with Israel from 2004 to 2009, and was a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations of 2007 to 2008. He's also an adjunct instructor in Arab studies at Georgetown University. We also have with us our very own executive director, Dr. Osama Abuirshaid. He's also a board member of the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations, which is an umbrella organization of 8 major national American Council organizations. He lectures frequently on Middle East and American politics. He's a regular commentator on Palestinian and Middle Eastern affairs, as well as on American domestic and foreign policy on various Arabic satellite TV channels, such as Al Jazeera. He authored and co-authored several books in Arabic, and he published dozens of studies and articles in Arabic and English on issues relevant to the Middle East and its political climate, one of which is Hamas, ideological rigidity, and political flexibility. I had to cut your bios in half, or actually 3/4, just to have some time to get into the theme here and get into this major and very important topic. So, Khaled, I want to throw a question to the panel, and I want each of you to pick up from where the other left off. And Khaled, I want to start with you. So the trajectory of U.S. policy on Jerusalem from 48 to 2017 has been more or less consistent. And in 2017, Trump broke with longstanding U.S. policy and declared Jerusalem Israel's capital and eventually moved the embassy there shortly thereafter. So we're approaching the 5th anniversary of the Trump declaration. How would you contextualize and situate U.S. policy since 1948 and especially since 2017? Please take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Tarek, and it's a pleasure to be with AMP for this event. So as you indicated, from 1947 to 2017, U.S. policy toward Jerusalem was, at least on paper, fairly consistent. The core of the policy essentially was that the U.S. did not recognize any country's sovereignty over any part of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, as it was defined in the UN Partition Plan of 1947 as a Corpus Separatum within those specified borders, And secondly, that Jerusalem's status could only be decided through direct negotiations. That remained U.S. policy even after Israel occupied the other half of Jerusalem in 1967. And in fact, U.S. Jerusalem policy was the only policy, at least as far as I can tell, that was still based on the 1947 partition plan, because after 1967, the entire basis of the peace process had changed. But for that one aspect, all of that remained the case up until the Trump era, specifically in late 2017, when Trump dramatically shifted U.S. policy. And I think it's impossible really to overstate the significance of Trump's policy shift on Jerusalem. So Trump's proclamation in late 2017 did two things. First was to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, ostensibly in line with U.S. law, in particular the 1995 Jerusalem Embassy Relocation Act. And secondly, to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv, and where most other countries have their embassies, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, at the location that had previously been the U.S. Consulate General. By recognizing Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem, U.S. broke with the international consensus based on international law. Almost all other countries, for that reason, kept their embassies in Tel Aviv. And it also broke with longstanding U.S. policy. The New Jerusalem policy was mired in a number of contradictions. Specifically, the Trump proclamation stated that the United States government, despite recognizing Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem, was in fact not taking a position on any final status issues, including the specific boundaries of the Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem. And it continued to maintain that the final status, including sovereignty over Jerusalem, would have to be determined in negotiations between the parties. On the other, but this raises a sort of a logical problem, because how do you recognize Israeli sovereignty over an area without specifying where the boundaries are of that area or defining it in some way? So what is it that you are recognizing, and where does that recognition apply? Officially, the U.S. is silent, but of course, the vagueness, the lack of clarity there has very clear implications. Where does it apply? Is it applied to Israeli-defined Jerusalem, which includes the annexed East Jerusalem, which no other country had recognized, including the United States, up until then? Was it just West Jerusalem that most countries had more or less acquiesced in and effectively recognized Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem, or was it some other definition of Jerusalem? These are things that were never clarified. If you wanted, you could even interpret the Trump proclamation as signifying U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, but without recognizing Israeli sovereignty over any part of Jerusalem. That is, I think, given the wording of the proclamation, a valid interpretation. But of course, it's completely nonsensical. This vagueness, I think, was of course deliberate. In practical terms, the lack of clarity serves to reinforce realities on the ground. Wherever there is a vagueness or lack of clarity, reality on the ground basically fills in the blanks. And it seems pretty clear from my standpoint, at least, that this was intentional, essentially to lend legitimacy to Israel's definition of Jerusalem, which of course includes that part of East Jerusalem, that part of the West Bank that was East Jerusalem that was annexed by Israel. The fact that the Trump administration told us exactly why Trump made this proclamation in the first place, and that is to, quote, take Jerusalem off the table, I think reinforces that conclusion. So the Biden administration has essentially inherited this Trump policy in all of its all of its contradictions. Moreover, Biden has chosen not to modify or even clarify any aspect of that policy towards Jerusalem. So this applies clearly to maintaining the embassy in Jerusalem, which is something that candidate Joe Biden had promised to do beforehand, and has since reiterated that that the embassy would remain in Jerusalem and that there would be no change. But it also applies to the vagueness surrounding the definition of what is Jerusalem. If you ask US officials today, what is Jerusalem? Where does the US recognize Israeli sovereignty? I would be very surprised if you got a straight answer of any sort. In a way, the Biden policy is sort of captive to its own lack of clarity. For example, the promise to reopen the US consulate general in Jerusalem, which is something that the Palestinian leadership has been demanding and pushing for since this administration came to office. But the administration has basically put that off. So even that that promise to reopen the consulate general was put off, I think, in part because any attempt to clarify U.S. policy around Jerusalem or its current status will necessarily run afoul of the Israeli government and, to a large extent, our own domestic politics in terms of Republicans in Congress, as well as the very influential pro-Israel lobby here in Washington.
Oh, thank you for that, Khaled, for giving us that very important historical context, especially since 2017. Lara, I know you've written on this topic as well. Is there anything you wanted to add or further contextualize, especially pre-17 or post-2017?
Sure. And I think Khaled did a brilliant job sort of summarizing where we were and how we got where we are today. I think it's important to realize that to some extent, U.S. policy has been remarkably consistent when it comes to Jerusalem. And here's, I think, the difference between the policy on paper, the rhetoric, and the actual policy. Because the actual policy, certainly since '67, has been a policy characterized first and foremost by Israeli impunity. And I think that's really important. If you go back, and people, I think, rightly focus on the shift in policy that we had under Trump, in which Biden has inherited, there was a shift in rhetorical policies, there was a shift in recognition. But the bottom line is, even before Trump, there was a policy of impunity, of giving. Israel enjoyed total impunity in Jerusalem. Israel settling across all of East Jerusalem, Israel taking land, Israel marginalizing the Palestinian population, depriving them of rights, Israel expanding the legal boundaries of Jerusalem, has taken a large chunk of the West Bank, and then over time expanding it further with this concept of Greater Jerusalem, which is never officially defined and really ends up eating up like a third of the West Bank. I mean, the U.S. challenged these things on paper and rhetoric, but the de facto, the real policy, if you want to distinguish between the language, the paper, and what people actually did before Trump, looked a lot like after Trump, which is there are no consequences for Israel, scoffing at U.S. policy and really defying international law. That wasn't a change. And I don't want to sound glib about this. To some extent, if you listen to Donald Trump or David Friedman at the time when this policy was changing, to some extent, they weren't wrong in suggesting that they were pretty much just saying out loud what the U.S. policy was. They were owning what the de facto policy already was, which is that this is Israel's capital and Israel can do what it wants. And they were setting aside the fiction that the U.S. prioritizes keeping the status of Jerusalem somehow ambiguous in order to allow for a future peace process that might somehow deal with Jerusalem. And that's, I think, very clarifying. I think if you go back and look at the battles that were fought over Jerusalem by administrations before the Trump administration, like I think the one that's the most telling is the Zivatovsky case, which is a case about a law passed by Congress that dealt with how Jerusalem was recorded on U.S. passports and reports of birth. And basically Congress said you have to record it as Israel, right? So in a sense, deciding by law that Jerusalem is part of Israel. And that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And that law was passed under Clinton. It was rejected by Clinton. It was rejected by Bush. It was rejected then by Obama. And then it went to the Supreme Court. And all along the way, each administration effectively, in their arguments against it, made the case that this is executive privilege, that they can't be forced to recognize a capital by Congress. And the sort of argument around it was, we have to keep this ambiguous so that we can get to a peace agreement and this will be negotiated. The Trump administration put the final period on that sentence, which said ended that line of argument, basically recognizing the reality that in Israel there's not been for a very long time a government that is interested in negotiating a two-state solution that would involve a Palestinian capital in Jerusalem. And even the most ardent two-state solution advocates will tell you there is no two-state solution without a Palestinian capital in Jerusalem. And the administration under Trump basically aligned U.S. policy officially with, if and when there's going to be some sort of negotiated solution, which they may or may not have had any interest, I would argue they didn't support, but regardless, it wasn't going to involve Jerusalem. But let's remember that even going back to previous administrations, we'd had experiments with, remember, we'll have a Palestinian capital in Abu Dis, Azariya. There was already this fantasy of the U.S. and Israel somehow constructing a capital for Palestinians that would be called Jerusalem, but wouldn't be Jerusalem. And already it was on the table as a U.S. negotiating point that there could be a future for Palestinians that didn't give them any role at all in Jerusalem. That predated Trump. Where we are today with the Biden administration inheriting now an overt U.S. policy of embracing the Israeli Greater Jerusalem framing, or the framing that basically says Jerusalem is not on the table in any meaningful way for negotiations, it's put them in a bind, because we still have a policy of impunity, right? Israel does what it wants still today in East Jerusalem. And administration, we are less likely to even hear rhetoric pushing back now than at any time, really, I think, pre-Trump. The position they're in today is, for people looking at whether they're going to reopen a consulate, and reopen is a complicated word because it would be opening something new, not reopening. But, as they look at this is a question of, do you spend political capital for doing something that doesn't achieve anything? And from their perspective, I think opening a consulate doesn't achieve anything. It ends impunity. And impunity is the watchword. And if you challenge impunity, you're going to pay a political price for being allegedly anti-Israel and possibly anti-Semitic. It's not going to promote a peace process, because there is no possibility of a two-state peace process now and maybe ever. And the bottom line is, where Trump has aligned U.S. policy on Jerusalem is where it already was de facto. So the Biden administration is in this awkward position, if it wants to say it's rolling back Trump policy, into having to much more, in a way that was to add meaning to what the policy was before, when the policy before was empty. And that's a very heavy lift for them, and I think it's extremely unappealing to them. I'll end there.
Oh, wow. Yeah, there's a whole lot that was definitely mentioned. Dr. Osama, there's a lot to work with there. Please give us your insight on U.S. policy vis-a-vis Jerusalem.
Okay, thank you, Tarek. First, I definitely agree with Khaled and Lara that the U.S. policy has been vague, but I will take it a step further. I would say that the U.S. policy has been, from the beginning, since 1947, can be categorized by, or characterized by, complicity and humiliating retreat in the face of Israel's belligerent rejection of to abide by international law and the international resolutions. And I will give a few examples here. Khaled mentioned some of them. Now, in 1947, there was a resolution 181, the UN resolution 181, that partitioned Palestine into an Arab and a Jewish state. The US was behind, pushed for this resolution. But when it came to its implications, when it came into how to deal with it on the ground, the US has a different take. So under the Truman administration, the US said, we're for the 181, that will give Israel part of the land, about 54%, but that did not include Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was not included under the Arab state or the envisioned Arab state as well. But Israel in 1948 occupied almost 84% of Jerusalem at the time, 84%. Jordan occupied or controlled about 11.5%. 10 minutes after Israel was announced or declared as a state, the Truman administration recognized Israel as in a de facto manner. A few days later, or a few months later, the US administration under Truman, or the Truman administration, recognized Israel as in a de jure fashion, while Israel was still occupying 84% of Jerusalem. So the Corpus Separatum was no longer in existence, although the US continued to say that it is for internationalizing Jerusalem, that to place Jerusalem under an international body. But in fact, the US recognized Israel with its borders after it was declared as a state in May 1948, that went way beyond what it was given under Resolution 181. So that gives you an example here, that the US, while it said something, it did something different. The same thing in 1980, when the United States under the Carter administration said we will not accept the Israeli Knesset decision to declare Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel, the Carter administration abstained from voting in the UN Security Council condemning this resolution, this decision by the state of Israel. And the list goes on and on. So now in 1947, we had the US saying something, but in 1967, when Israel occupied the rest of historical Palestine, the US under the Johnson administration had a different policy. Suddenly now the US under the Johnson administration wasn't talking anymore about the need to place Jerusalem under an international body. In fact, it wasn't talking about the illegal occupation of Israel of lands beyond what it was given under the 181 resolution. It dealt with it as the legitimate borders and the legitimate lands of the state of Israel. Jerusalem was part of it. So what the Johnson administration came up with in 1967 is land for peace. And to achieve land for peace, you have to have a comprehensive peace negotiations between the Arab states and between Israel, in which Israel will live in security and will enjoy sovereignty over the lands it occupied in pre-1967. So now we no longer are talking about the lands that were illegally occupied according to this international resolution 181, including Jerusalem. And it didn't stop there. The Johnson administration took it a step further when it announced that it wants Jerusalem to continue to be unified under one authority while open religiously. So Israel will continue to maintain Jerusalem under its control, but the issue is to allow Muslims, Christian, Jews to worship freely, to allow them access into the sacred places in Jerusalem. So the issue was no longer an issue of sovereignty, but it wasn't as clear as we see it today. Now all of the administrations since Johnson administration have been emphasizing this fact that this should be Jerusalem should continue to be unified and under one authority. But under the Clinton administration, it gave it a different meaning and gave it another depth when it said clearly that the Palestinians and the Jordanians under the Jordanian peace treaty with Israel in 1994 will have some sort of a special status of administering and managing the holy places inside Jerusalem or Old Jerusalem or East Jerusalem. But sovereignty will continue to be under Israel, because under the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, or the Bush administration in 2004, there was a resolution by Congress which Bush accepted that declared Israel as the unified, eternal capital of the state of Israel. Yes, Bush said this is not a resolution that we have to abide by as an administration, because we will take this as an advisory opinion. But in fact, it wasn't an advisory opinion. That's what led us to 2017, when Trump declared Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Because as Trump said, we're only recognizing a fact. The fact is that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Who allowed this to happen? It is the successive U.S. administrations since the Truman administration. Who leased the land in which now the U.S. embassy is established in Jerusalem? It was on the last day of the Reagan administration, when they leased that land for 99 years, for $1 a day. So now we cannot talk about a decision that was made in 2017 that happened in a void, because there was no void. Each administration paved the way for the next administration to take further steps to Judaize Jerusalem and to establish Israel, or to tighten Israel's grip over the city of Jerusalem until it was declared as the capital. Because yes, we were recognizing a fact. That's what happened. All of the Israeli governmental institutions are in Jerusalem. The Knesset in Jerusalem. The cabinet is in Jerusalem. So now you have to deal with that fact that the U.S. has allowed since 1947, because the U.S. was playing a complicit role, because the U.S. was allowing Israel to achieve this, while it was verbally saying that we're against it. Under the Clinton administration, there was another shift. It's not only that the Congress passed a resolution that declared Jerusalem as the capital, regardless now of the clause that gives the president a 6 months waiver. Now there was another stand taken by the Clinton administration when it declared that it no longer considers the settlements in East Jerusalem as illegal. They became now an obstacle for peace. And unfortunately, the Palestinian leadership played also a complicit role, because under the Bush senior administration in 1991, they accepted the guarantees letter by the Bush administration when it made Jerusalem as a final status issue, an issue that is not going to be discussed in 1991 in the Madrid conference, an issue that continued to persist under the Oslo agreement. Unfortunately, it was declared as a final issue status, and that further allowed Israel to continue its dominance over Jerusalem and to tighten its grip over Jerusalem. And all of that happened with the U.S. support. So what I want us here to understand, that the U.S. has been complicit since day one, and it is the U.S. that allowed Israel to tighten its grip over Jerusalem and to establish its sovereignty. It said one thing and it did another thing. And that is why we're dealing with this situation today.
Wow. Okay. There's a whole lot there that I really want to tackle. But just for the audience's edification, a lot of words were said, and there's some words that some audience members may not know. So I just want to, just for clarification's sake, the difference when we say de facto versus de jure, simply that means de facto means is the state of affairs that actually exists. So it's something that's happening in fact. De jure means it's something that is sanctioned by law. So in case you're listening in, that's the distinction between those two. And the Latin term corpus separatum, which was mentioned, I believe, by all three speakers, that means body, literal translation is body separated. So there was the UN resolution that Dr. Osama mentioned, 18181, that talked about separating the land, Arab state, Jewish state. Jerusalem was supposed to be a body separated, separate from both entities. So just a bit of clarification on that. I wanted to tackle the question of ambiguity, because Lara and Khaled, you both talked, you mentioned that term. Now, I remember Nikki Haley coming out and saying one huge line that says, Jerusalem is off the table. Trump reiterated that many times. This was post the Trump declaration. So if you could just expound on the ambiguity aspect there, because I believe that the following statements that came from the chief executive officer, the president, and Nikki Haley, the ambassador to the UN, made it clear that Jerusalem is off the table.
I guess I'll take a first stab at that. I mean, I think that's right. It's not just ambiguity. It's actually ambivalence, as I think Osama did a very fine job of describing U.S. and Lara as well. There's a huge gap, and there has always been this gap between the stated official U.S. policy, which is supposed to be in line with the requirements of international law and diplomacy and all of that, and the actual U.S. policy, which is more often than not a function of domestic politics. And so, what is pushing that gap is that both of these aspects, the de facto and the de jure policies, are motivated by entirely different sets of priorities. One is diplomatic and geopolitics and U.S. interests on some level, and the other is basically domestic politics. And that ambiguity was important because it was how administration sort of fudged those differences. The problem that the Trump administration posed is that they did away with that gap. They simply took the de facto policy and made it the de jure policy, which was problematic because then it became harder to maintain. Well, the U.S. still supports a two-state solution. The U.S. still supports international law on some level or legitimacy on some level. And in a way, the Trump administration sort of called previous administrations bluff. And the problem is that the Biden administration has gone back to the bluff, but when we've already seen it exposed, right? And so they're not even really trying to dress it back up. They've just sort of reverted to actually some combination of past U.S. policy. But when it comes to Jerusalem policy in particular, it is still Trump policy in its entirety. This is the Trump policy. Trying to square that with the requirements of an actual two-state solution is very, very difficult. So by not clarifying the policy, Biden is not really doing himself any favors, because the goals of the Trump administration in calling that bluff are entirely different than the goals of this administration. And so if they're going to clarify the policy, they're going to have to revert and bring instead of they're going to have to bring the de jure policy, the de facto policy, in line with the de jure policy. So in other words, they're going to have to, flip the old paradigm, which they're not even attempting to do. That's the problem.
Yeah, if I could just add, the bottom line for the whole peace process, and this goes back again to the word ambiguity and constructive ambiguity, the entire policy framework that brought Palestinians to the table was a framework which said simultaneously, trust us, we're serious, and through a negotiating process, you'll get what you need. And also said to the Israelis, don't worry, we're not promising anything to the Palestinians, you can trust us and come to the table. And in terms of U.S. politics, if you look at the battle between, say, Democrats and Republicans on this, that ambiguity has worked politically as well. right? So a Republican sort of speaks the language of supporting peace and two-state solution while everyone trusts that they're not going to do that. Trump used that language coming in largely, but everyone knew he didn't mean it. And with Obama, it was sort of held against him. Well, he might actually mean it. But the bottom line is the language was always about defending a perpetual U.S. contradiction between what we said our policy was and what it actually was on the ground, and demanding that the Palestinians accept that to come to the table. Where we are today, as Khaled points out, is I don't know if it's a conundrum for the Biden administration, because the Biden administration doesn't want to spend political capital on this anyway. So I think it's not such a problem for them. It's a real problem for the PA. It's a real problem for Palestinians who still support negotiations as a path to some sort of resolution, because the constructive ambiguity has been eliminated, right? You can no longer say, well, fine, they're not standing up and they're not putting consequences on Israel to make them stop doing X, Y, Z and whatever, but we trust them because they're still using this language of not recognizing, therefore we're going to get to the table. And it's incredibly difficult to make a case that Palestinians, the PA, the PLO can come to the table and expect to pick up where they left off before, which was not a strong place, but it was a place where they at least had ambiguity on their side. They no longer have that either.
So, Dr. Osama, I want to transition to you and you can add to this, but I want to present a question as well. Is if that's the case, then the only way out from that constructive ambiguity would be for Biden to rescind the Trump declaration altogether then, right?
Yes, but we know that he's not going to do it, because this is the same dilemma that the successive U.S. administrations have been facing since the Truman administration. The Truman administration wasn't happy with many of Israel's announcements in relation to Jerusalem. When Ben-Gurion in 1949 announced that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, the Truman administration refused and rejected that declaration, but there was an immense pressure here in the US from the Zionist lobby on the administration, so it had to backtrack. Same thing happened under the Eisenhower administration in relation to Jerusalem in 1953, when Israel announced that it's going to relocate its foreign ministry from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Secretary Dallas at the time instructed U.S. Officials in Israel not to meet with their counterparts in Jerusalem, and not to seek any negotiations or any dealings with officials in Jerusalem. A year and a half, not even a year and a half, the U.S. backtracked, and Dallas himself, allowed the U.S. officials to meet, and the U.S. Staff in the U.S. embassy in Tel Aviv to meet with their counterparts in Israel in Jerusalem. So same thing happened under the Carter administration. Same thing happened with the Obama administration, when Obama said that we're not going to accept that Israel continues its settlements, mainly in East Jerusalem. But again, Israel did not listen, and there was no consequences for Israel. So the fact is, Biden understands this history and knows that there will be an immense pressure here, mainly now that he has something else playing into his advantage, or playing into Israel's advantage, and that is that many Arab states have signed agreements with Israel without any regard to the Palestinians' rights. And we remember when the Abraham Accords were signed in the White House in 2020, when Netanyahu was boasting about the fact that not even a single Arab state of those who signed these agreements asked about the Palestinians. So it is no longer conditioned upon an advancement in the on the Palestinian front. That's what he said, and he was very clear about it. The Emiratis promised that this is going to help the situation in Jerusalem. Now what? It's 2 years now since they signed these agreements, about 2 years, in September 2020. Nothing has changed. In fact, now the Arab official delegations are meeting with Israeli officials in Jerusalem, and they're visiting the holy sites under Israeli protection. So that gives you an indication why the Biden administration would not be interested in antagonizing Israel and its supporters here in the US, because the Arabs have abandoned the Palestinians and have abandoned the Palestinian rights, mainly in relation to Jerusalem here. So I'm not very optimistic that this administration will take on this issue. It's not only because they have other issues to worry about in Ukraine and in Europe, or in trying to contain China in Eastern Asia, or the pivot to Asia, or the domestic issues that is consuming this president and consuming the Democrats. I don't think that the Democrats are in the mood for a clash with Israel. And this was not only the situation under the Biden administration. Let's go back to the Obama administration. Obama did place a lot of pressure on Israel, but he ended up backing away from every promise that he made. Although yes, he did not leave before he allowed a resolution to pass in the UN Security Council. I think it was 2334, that defined the occupied territories, because there is now a disagreement. Is it the occupied territories or occupied territories? So no one knows. It's the full the whole land that was occupied after June 5th, 1967, or is it some parts of that property, that land that was occupied after 1967? Now that's a different story. So the Obama administration allowed a resolution or allowed a vote in the UN Security Council on 2334 that defined the whole land that was occupied after June 5th, 1967, to be the occupied territory that was mentioned in this UN Security Council Resolution 224. But that was not placed under Article 7 in the UN Security Council. So it means nothing. It has no consequences. Israel will not suffer anything because of it, because the Obama administration itself would have not allowed it. So we need to keep this in context and understand that the U.S., even maybe it sees that it is in the best interest of the U.S. and it is in the best interest of what they call a peace process, to divide Jerusalem or to allow the Palestinians some sort of sovereignty, whether over the two Arab neighborhoods in Jerusalem or some religious sovereignty in over the religious sites in Jerusalem. But still, when Israel says no, the U.S. does not try to pressure Israel or to allow consequences on Israel because of its defiance of the international resolutions and of the international law. So I'm not very optimistic here, and I think this is going to continue regardless of whether we have Ukraine or whether we have some Arab states are willing to sack the Palestinians for nothing. It doesn't matter. This was the situation for over 70 years now, and it did not change. I don't see it changing in the near future. It will take a lot of efforts here in the US to build a new momentum, a new movement for the Palestinian rights, and a fundamental change in the Arab and in Palestine itself, in the Arab world and in Palestine, where the Arab will put Palestine and will be one of their priorities, and it will be always on the table, and the Palestinians will get their act together and depart from this nonsense that has been defining the Palestinian situation since 1991. Since 1991, the Palestinian leadership have been trusting and placing all of its eggs in the U.S. basket, and we've seen where this has led them now. No guarantees in 1991 in the guarantees letters. It was about everything but the guarantees. You know, Bush Sr. told the Palestinians, although we're not going to discuss Jerusalem now, but we understand and we commit that Jerusalem will be on the table. So we go to 1993, and there is the Oslo Accords, and Jerusalem again is a final status issue. And then we come to 2003 under Bush, the Bush administration, and again Jerusalem is not on the table. And in 2004, Bush's promise that recognize the status quo, the facts on the ground, as he put it. There are facts on the ground. The settlements are facts on the ground. We cannot change it. Then the Obama administration comes, tries to apply some pressure on Israel, but the Obama administration fails and fails utterly. And then we end up by upping the U.S. military aid to Israel from $3.1 billion to $3.8 billion for 10 years. And now under the Biden administration, who came promising that at least he's going to reopen the U.S. consulate in Eastern Jerusalem, but he's yet to deliver on his promise because of the fierce pressure that he's facing. So we have to understand that this is the U.S. complicity, whether willingly or unwillingly. This is the U.S. complicity, and we should not expect anything better from these administrations, successive administrations, until you have the power to effect change here, and you have a fundamental change in the Arab world and in the Palestinian internal arena.
Thank you for that so much, Dr. Osama. And just to be fair to George Bush, he called them Israeli population centers in his letter, not Israeli settlements. He was very political in the way that he framed it. I did want to ask a question that you let me know if it's something that we need to dwell on at all or not. We talked about Netanyahu a lot, but he's no longer prime minister. We have Naftali Bennett since 2021. Does that impact anything in any way? Positive, negative, nothing, neutral?
So I will say, I mean, in terms of the actual policy, Bennett is not a lefty, which isn't to say that the prime ministers of the left have been any better on Jerusalem really than prime ministers on the right. But he is a prime minister of the right. He is leading a coalition government that is by nature extraordinarily fragile, as we have certainly seen in the past few days. I think a lot of us predicted, and it has been accurate, that the main difference for good or for bad is that when you have a government in anything but Bibi sort of move in the international community, the government that now exists, which is fragile, is in a strong position to say to people, don't pressure us on things that are going to be politically divisive. Our government might fall. And it's been really a wonderful way, I think, of keeping pressure at bay, if there were going to be pressure, whether it's from the U.S. government or from Europe or anybody else. The government of Naftali Bennett has pursued deeply problematic policies on Jerusalem from day one. And I know there can be arguments made that they have been, quote unquote, more responsible with respect to the Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount, in terms of things were so horrific under Bibi. So now there's a more responsible. But anyone who looked at the optics of people being beaten in the last round of the last kerfuffle around the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, responsible is in the eyes of the beholder. We've seen settlements continue. We've seen land seizures continue. We've seen demolitions spike. We see E1 is back on the agenda. Speaking of Greater Jerusalem, we see Walaja back on the agenda. I mean, it's sort of like, if for years those of us who work on Jerusalem thought that there were some red lines that the international community would never tolerate being crossed, and therefore Israel wouldn't cross them, certainly in the past decade under Bibi, but through the current day, what Israel is demonstrating day in, day out, is that there really are no red lines. And to the extent that Israel can be asked to delay crossing a red line, the cost is that they cross other red lines. So like with E1 back on the agenda now, just before our president goes out to visit, will the US be engaging quietly behind the scenes to try to get E1 off the agenda? And for people who don't know, E1 is this huge settlement complex just outside of Jerusalem, part of the Greater Jerusalem bubble, which people have for years talked about as the final nail in the coffin of the two-state solution. If you still believe it's alive, fine. But I can imagine behind the scenes that there's pressure to get E1 taken off the table. I imagine that if they succeed, the cost will be the U.S. staying silent about some other red line being crossed by the settlers, with Bennett and company saying, we spent political capital pushing this back. We can't do this. You can't ask us to also stop this. So, I mean, if I don't think there's a change for the better with respect to Jerusalem. I think people who thought anything but Bibi were mistaken. And I think there's a really good chance that the government that replaces the current government, whether in the immediate future or the slightly more distant future, is going to be a retread of the Bibi government, but even more hardline, because that's the trajectory of Israeli politics right now.
Did any of you want to add to that? Okay, and interestingly, just on the question of E1, and thank you for explaining what that is, Lara, and you did mention that earlier, the concept of Greater Jerusalem. I just wanted just a quick follow up on that. So this concept, it's really just a furtherance of the Israeli entrenchment of the occupation, and to maintain this demographic engineering policy, and to really kick it up a notch by including those settlement blocks that you talked about, Malay Adumim, I think it was Gush Etzion, Givat Sa'ivin, so north, south, and east, I believe, but it's also meant to get rid of large Palestinian communities. Kufar Aqab comes to mind, Shafat refugee camp. These are heavily populated Palestinian communities. So is that even part of U.S. policy? Is that something that U.S. policy even looks at? The demographic engineering policy of Israel to maintain a 70-30, 60-40 demographic ratio in the municipality of Jerusalem. I mean, that is why I titled this webinar Jerusalem, U.S. Foreign Policy, not East Jerusalem, because it's looked at in this holistic way to maintain this demographic balance. Does U.S. policy have anything to say on that? I feel like that Palestinians are alone in that particular issue of the Jerusalem question.
I guess I'll take a stab at that. I think historically U.S. policy has opposed things like home demolitions and evictions and ID confiscations. You know, the revocation of Palestinian Jerusalemites of their residency rights, and this administration has been, I think, reflects that opposition. For the most part, they've made a commitment that they would only express those concerns privately. So we don't see public criticism, but we are told that they are trying to restrain or push back against some of these policies, particularly in Sheikh Jarrah, in terms of the E1 plan. I'm sure they're also pushing back on, but for the reasons that Lara already explained, if they push too hard on one issue and they expend political capital in one particular aspect, well, then that diminishes their ability to push on other issues. And so as a net result, there really isn't much change. It's kind of like a shell game. Well, okay, they can push back on violations of the status quo arrangement in the holy sites, but that means they can't push too hard on the evictions, or they push too hard on the evictions. It means they can't push too hard on E1. And so there's always a trade-off. There's always a political transaction that is happening, at least in the minds of American decision makers. And just to go back to the previous question about differences between this government and the Netanyahu government, I don't see any discernible differences in terms of policies on the ground. They are both pursuing, the settlement policies have sort of a life of their own, and they are continuing regardless of who is the prime minister. But where there's a difference is in the international response. And I think for exactly the reasons that Lara pointed out, there is, in a paradoxical way, less incentive to push back on the current government that is seen, at least in broad terms, as somehow more pragmatic and more moderate, despite the very strong right-wing currents that dominate this coalition. And so there's reluctance to push on them because the alternative is worse. The alternative is a return of Netanyahu or Netanyahu's successor, who will be further to the right. And so the paradoxical result is that Palestinians in Jerusalem in particular may actually be worse off under this government, because there is no incentive for the international community to push back.
I just want to keep in mind that under Peace to Prosperity, or Trump's plan, or the deal of the century, it doesn't only talk about land swap. It also talks about population swap, transferring Palestinians under Israel's control, who are Israeli citizens, into the Palestinian envisioned state. And in return, Israel will control and will have full sovereignty, legal sovereignty over the settlement with the approval of the Palestinians in the West Bank, including which East Jerusalem is part of. So this is something that is clearly suggested there in that plan, the what we call the triangle or Qura al-Muthallath, or the towns of al-Muthallath, the triangle. And the Biden administration did not take an official stand on Trump's plan, did not back away from it. Yes, it's not pushing for it, but Israel is behaving as if that plan is the US plan, and it's continuing to establish new facts on the ground to fulfill that plan. Bennett is no less extremist than Netanyahu. This government, the current government, as it may be dysfunctional, but when it comes to these things, it is very functional. Even the Arab members or the Arab bloc that that is giving the safety net to this government is unfortunately not really eager or interested in bringing down this government because of Israel's continuation of expanding its settlements or building new settlements or continuing to enfranchise the Palestinians inside these settlements or inside Jerusalem, as in Sheikh Jarrah. These are facts that are being established on a daily basis on the ground. Israel will not accept to leave a huge percentage of the Palestinian population under its control because it wants to get rid of them. And the Palestinians have no plan to push back against Israel because there is no Palestinian leadership at this point, and there is no project. There is no one knows what the Palestinian leadership really wants. Do you want to engage with Israel, or do you want to continue to complain about Israel's violations of all of the previous agreements without doing anything about it, without taking a step, to confront what Israel is doing? So I think in this vacuum, Israel is continuing and it's being very successful in establishing new facts on the ground. This is very unfortunate, but I think eventually, if nothing changes here, we will be talking in a few years from now about a different situation that we're warning of now, but it will be the fact of tomorrow. And the US will not do anything. I mean, as Khaled said, you will hear the US saying, okay, we don't like what Israel is doing in Sheikh Jarrah. We don't like what Israel is doing in Jerusalem. We don't like what Israel is doing in Gaza, but we're talking to them privately. Would you hold them responsible? No, we're talking to them privately. Would you accept the Amnesty's report on Israel as an apartheid, Human Rights Watch report on Israel as an apartheid, B'Tselem's report on Israel as an apartheid? No, we disagree with it. But you will accept the same reports when they condemn Russia and Ukraine. So that shows you, if we want to continue to talk about the US complicity, I think that's a fact by itself that has been well established. We have to go beyond this, beyond just analyzing where the US stands, because we know where the US stands. But what is next in this context? That's, I think, where we're missing, where the Palestinians are unable to deliver an answer. And I'm not, of course, holding them responsible for everything, because you're dealing with Israel. Israel is a superpower in that region. And Israel now has the recognition of many of the Arab states, and even those who don't recognize Israel officially, they are dealing with Israel. We know that Mohammed bin Salman was the current Saudi crown prince in 2017. We know what he told Mahmoud Abbas when he invited him in November 2017 into Riyadh, and he told him, accept or resign. That's exactly what he told him. Accept what the Trump administration is offering you, or resign. So the Palestinians are left with no political cover. The US is not helping them. The Arabs are not helping them. And they're not helping themselves, because we have that split within Palestine, and it's unfortunate Now we don't have a project, we don't have a national project, we don't know what what the Palestinians are willing to accept, the minimum that they're going to accept, or what your alternatives are. What if this continues? Are you going to continue to threaten that you will withdraw your recognition of Israel that was issued in 1993? We've been hearing this for 5-6 years. In the 5-6 years, Israel established more facts on the grounds. So again, we're dealing with a very complicated complex situation here, but honestly, I don't think anyone has the answer to the when it comes to the solution. But continuing to say that the U.S. is complicit, I think, is just confirming a fact, not coming up with something new or a new analysis here.
Well, I mean, okay, so I just want to end it on this note. So what is it that President Biden or future successor can do to take U.S. policy in the direction of neutral arbiter and just try to, I know this is a question that, I probably won't get an optimistic or hopeful answer on, but what can be done to change the U.S. role from Israel's lawyer to being a neutral arbiter? What can be done here?
I'll go first this time. So I don't think the U.S. is going to be a neutral arbiter. I think if the U.S. is going to be constructive, that's a decision. I mean, the list of what they can do is, that's just a creative policy exercise. The bottom line is, until the U.S. is really to hold Israel accountable, to set rules and hold them accountable, then our policy is not credible. And our de facto policy is what basically was declared to be under Trump. As soon as the U.S. makes a decision to hold Israel accountable and to stand by that, and as Dr. Abuirshaid said, I mean, Obama tried this. He lost his nerve, right? And there's really nothing worse than standing up to a bully and then giving in. That's worse than not standing up to them at all. If you get to a point where the U.S. is willing to stand up to Israel and stand behind that position and show that there will be consequences, then it's a whole new game, because that changes the political dynamics in Israel as well. People Bibi is somehow being hugely ideological and irrational for challenging the Obama administration over and over. There's nothing irrational. It worked for him. It absolutely worked. He drove a truck over the Obama administration's policy, and they basically said, thank you, do it again. Until that dynamic changes, then the U.S. policy is what it is, and it is a policy of standing by passively and letting Israel decide what the outcome is. And us, if we spend political capital, we're wasting it, right? Because we're just doing it symbolically to achieve nothing except to get attacked for being, anti-Israel, because you say something it's not even meaningful. But I mean, to the extent that any administration decides to shift that dynamic, and they don't have to shift it, in a massive way, any shift in that dynamic to have some accountability would change the dynamic between the U.S. and Israel, and would change the dynamic inside Israel. You saw that happen with Obama when great hope was raised by him holding firm on a settlement freeze. And you saw this happen previously. You saw this happen when Bush 1, held the line on the settlement loan guarantees. This is ancient history, and it ended up being, I would say, an own goal for U.S. policy. But regardless, I mean, when the Israeli people see that there is a cost to butting heads with the U.S., then their analysis of what is good or bad for Israel changes. And Israelis today who say we have literally nothing to lose by continuing to conflict with the U.S. that says they want peace, and we have nothing to gain by making compromises, they're not irrational. They're right, and because that's the current dynamic.
Yeah, I agree with Lara completely, and I would just add that if we're probably not going to see any change in the current administration or a future administration until their own political calculations change. Right now, why is Biden taking these positions or doing as little as he's doing? Because he has no incentive to do otherwise, either because of domestic politics, right? There isn't a political cost yet to not affirming Palestinian rights, to deferring to Israeli priorities. That it is still, for the most part, politically cost-free, at least as far as this administration is calculating, doing the political math and coming to that conclusion. that could change. And I think there are signs that the politics are changing. And eventually we would expect the shift in politics to change the priorities and calculations of a future, at least democratic administration, because that's where the change is happening most clearly. But it also has no incentive in terms of the realities in the region. Imagine if you're the U.S. president and you want to fall on your sword and pay a political price. Who are you going to pay that political price for? Mahmoud Abbas, frankly. I mean, this is the leadership that is going to carry the ball forward. This is not a leadership, and I think I'm not saying anything controversial here. This is not a leadership that inspires confidence in anyone to take political risks, whether it's the United States or Europe or even the Arab states. Part of the Arabs walking away from the Palestinians is because of this Palestinian failure. It is an internal, indigenous failure on their part. I mean, certainly they don't own all of this, but the total dysfunction and disarray of the Palestinian national movement is a major disincentive for outside parties to want to. You cannot accept Biden or Arab leaders to be more Palestinian than the Palestinians. And so I expect things will change only when Palestinians begin to put their own internal house in order, and then create it. And then, of course, there would have to be changes in political calculations domestically here in the United States. And when those two converge, when you get those, then you have the ingredients of a very different kind of approach to this. But we are, I think, a ways off from seeing that.
Well, I completely agree with Laura and Khaled, and as you know, while we cannot change the situation and the dynamics within Palestine internally, or change the dynamics in the Arab world from here, I think one thing we can do is to change the dynamics here to affect the political calculations in this country. Now, we know that the trajectory is changing in this country. Now, slowly but surely, the public opinion polls show that there is a genuine change that is taking place, but it's not with the speed that we want. It's going to take time. But that's part of the work that we do. We have to continue to educate the American people about Palestine, educate our politicians, elect the right people to Congress, and we have to continue our advocacy and our lobbying in this country. That's part of the dynamics that we need to continue to work on to change some of the political calculations. But I will give one last example. During the last attack on Gaza last year, this administration, the Biden administration, had to intervene because the dynamics over there were not totally in favor of Israel. Now, regardless of where you stand on entity A or entity B, that has nothing to do with anything. What I'm talking about here, the cold reality of politics. Israel was unable to win that war. Eventually, the Biden administration has to intervene because much of the blame was on the shoulders of the United States, because it is the United States that gives Israel the political cover. It is the United States that allows Israel to commit war crimes with impunity. It is the United States that that gives Israel the military financial aid and weapons. It is the United States, and everyone expects that the United States will step up. If you want to be the dominant superpower or the sole superpower, you want to be, you want to have a say everywhere, like in Ukraine now and with Russia. And if you want to stand up to Russia, then you have to show the same moral courage and the same moral standards when it comes to the situation in Palestine, mainly when people are being slaughtered, literally slaughtered, and these crimes are being done under your name. And when Israel claimed that it has informed the U.S. administration, the Biden administration, before it destroyed the Jalal Tower that hosted the AP and Al Jazeera and other media outlets. the Biden administration felt the pressure and felt that it was being exposed by Israel, and they said, no, we wouldn't consulted here, because these are clear war crimes that were being committed by Israel, and now suddenly Israel is trying to drag the U.S. into it. So I think part of the fact that Israel was unable to win an aggression that it launched on Gaza, an aggression that it launched on the Palestinians in Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah and the Silwan neighborhood, and you need to complement this with another reality where politicians also will find some sort of safety net, that if you speak out against Israel, against the Israeli policies, that does not mean that you're going to end up losing the elections or paying a political price. I think we've seen now that there is a real change that is taking place. It's not to the extent that we want it. It's not as deep as we want it. It's not as profound as we want it. But I think we've seen some nuisance now. Could be baby steps, but they're taking place now.
No, absolutely. We're definitely seeing a shift in the way Americans perceive this question, and it's largely has to do with the work that we do on the ground and the work that you all do. Thank you all so much for being a part of this. I greatly appreciate it very much. Thank you all for coming, and have a blessed rest of your day. Thank you all very much. Thank you again.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
مع السلامة.